So I was telling you last time that according to Aristotle, the final purpose of human life is eudaimonia, which he defines as an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. So the light that shines on human nature is that when human beings cultivate virtue, then they become more human and they move towards the final purpose of human life, which is eudaimonia, or well-being. So human nature is a task, it's a movement towards eudaimonia, well-being. And the road to the actualization of human nature then is the cultivation of virtue, or arte. Now, we also said that for Aristotle, there are two kinds of virtues, the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. So after having set out his whole theory in outline form in book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, in book 2, 3, 4, and 5, he develops his moral theory. And this moral theory came to be called virtue ethics. Book 5 is all about one moral virtue, which is very important, both for politics and ethics. And remember, ethics is a branch of politics for Aristotle. The two sciences that study the highest good for humans and what are the conditions that make possible the achievement of that highest good, which is eudaimonia. For politics, it's the well-being of the people. For ethics, it's the well-being of the individual. So his theory of moral virtue has to do with the cultivation of character. So the word arte, excellence, means excellence of character or excellence of the intellect. And we said that the psychological foundations of the moral and intellectual virtues are as follows. All the moral virtues accrue in someone's character when deliberative reason makes choices habitually, and the appetitive part of our soul is obeying and becomes like trained. And those are the psychological dynamics that are the basis of the development of the moral virtues. So after having laid out his whole theory in outline form in book 1, books 2, 3, 4 lay out his whole theory of the moral virtues. And book 5 then concentrates on one, namely justice, which is so important both for politics and ethics. Justice is one of those things that have to do with both a state can be just or unjust, like a fascist state is an unjust state. We've come to agree, most people have actually. And there are people who are just and unjust. So the virtue of justice is both political and ethical. So he develops a whole book, book of the 10 books of the Nicomachean Ethics devoted to justice. That's book 5. So let me just give you some observations and comments about his moral theory that are key to understanding his moral theory. The first thing he says in book 2 is that moral excellence is the result of habit. And the Greek word for habit is hexis, H-E-X-I-S. So it just means doing something in the same way, repetitively. So characteristics develop from corresponding activities. Not just virtue comes from habits, but vice too, which is the opposite of virtue, which is the opposite of virtue, right? So characteristics, whether they're virtuous or vices, they develop from our habits. That's common sense. That's the realism of Aristotle. Aristotle is the father, as I said before, of this great school of thought called realism. And when it comes to his ethical theory, a lot of that sounds like common sense. and rather than um, being overly theoretical and speculative, he's got his feet on the ground when it comes to certain things. Although it's very intellectual, at the same time, it's based on common sense. And it's everyone knows, if they haven't thought about it, they just know it intuitively, that we are who we are partially and to a great extent by the way we behave. So if you act in a certain way habitually, then that's how you become. So characteristics develop from corresponding activities. So everything is based on habit, okay? And he makes that point in the first section of book 2. But the key, after he makes some subtle distinctions like the difference between virtuous action and actual virtue, there are actions that are virtuous, but they may not flow naturally from a virtuous character. Like it's virtuous to be generous, but if you're being generous in order to get something back, like a quid pro quo, if you're being generous in that way, then it's not generosity. It looks like generosity, but if you look at the motive, you're only doing it to get something back. So he makes a distinction between actions that develop moral virtue and actions that actually flow naturally from a virtuous disposition. If I have a child and I notice that she's being stingy, and I tell her that I'm not going to buy her any more toys unless she starts being a little more generous and playing nicely with her friends with her toys, and then she starts sharing her toys, that doesn't mean she's generous. That just means she's afraid that if she doesn't share her toys, then she's not going to get any more toys. But one day may come, if she gets a habit of sharing her toys, that she becomes naturally generous. So there's a difference between actions that flow naturally from a particular disposition that's been shaped, and there's actions that are just overtly virtuous. So he makes distinctions like that. He's trying to give as much thought and precision to this subject matter that's not precise. But like he said in book 1, what we lose in precision, we gain in relevancy, because this is so important for life. And then, like he does, he taught humanity in his logical books. You know, I told you he actually invented logic. I mean, there was logic before him, but he made it into a discipline, and he invented deductive and inductive reasoning. And so he taught humanity that when you want to define something, you look at its genus and species. We talked about that. So we talked about it in terms of human nature. The genus of human nature for Aristotle is animal, but the species is reason. So humans are rational animals for Aristotle. That's like the most famous and far-reaching and influential definition of human nature that's been given to us. There's a lot implicit in that, packed into that, but that's the definition. And so he's taught humanity to, if you want to define something, you find the class to which it belongs, that's called its genus, and then you ask of that thing that you're trying to define, how is it different from everything else in that class? That's called the specific difference, or the differentia. And nowadays, everything from the smallest subatomic particle all the way to the greatest nebulae in outer space and everything in between is defined in terms of genus and species, thanks to Aristotle. So what he does, he turns that way of thinking on everything when he wants to define something. So he defines in book 2 what is moral, what is virtue. And so the first thing is to find its genus. And he goes through all these different possibilities. He finds out, he comes to the conclusion that the genus of moral virtue is a disposition. Like when we say somebody has a kind disposition, you know, there's something about that person that's relatively stable, and you can count that that person is kind person, generally speaking. That's just one example. A disposition is a tendency to behave in a particular way. You're disposed to behave to behave in a certain way. So It's not a capacity, it's not an emotion, it's a disposition or a characteristic. So, and then the main thing is about the differentia, or the specific difference. How is moral virtue different from every other disposition? Because somebody could have a vicious disposition too. There are people who are irascible, for example, that they're hot-headed and they just fly off the handle quite easily and they start overreacting and they're angry all the time. That's called irascibility. So that's not a virtue, to be irascible. So then, but it's a disposition. So what is moral virtue? What is the differentia of moral virtue? And his answer to that is, and this became famous in the history of moral theory, it's a disposition to choose the proper measure with respect to our feelings and actions. Now, that's not rocket science. That's not too hard to understand, but it's pretty hard to disagree with that. I mean, there are certain times in life where it looks like we have to be extreme. We have to take extreme measures because of extreme circumstances. But for the most part, it's a task to find that proper measure with regard to what? Feelings or actions. So that word is called metron, M-E-T-R-O-N. And usually they translate that as mean. I mentioned that last time. That's not my favorite translation because Aristotle goes out of his way to say it's not an arithmetical mean. Like if you're moving through life and you have to choose how to respond to a particular situation, you're not going to do a statistical analysis and say, well, okay, this is a 9, this is a 1, I'll act as a 4. You don't, it's not an arithmetical mean. And also the word mean has other kind of connotations like average. It can mean numerical average, or it can mean like mediocre or mean-spirited, and it's got all kinds of connotations with it. So what I do, like I've said, I've come to this way of dealing with key words in philosophy that are in foreign languages. I just leave them in the language that they're in, the key words. The rest I just speak in English because I'm speaking and writing in English. But the key words, then why not just leave it in the language? Now with the Greek, what you would use is the transliteration. You wouldn't use actually ancient Greek letters unless you're in Greece and everyone knows the letters, but they're called transliterations. They still use like Latin letters, like A, B, C, like what we use, but they make the sounds of the ancient languages, or even in Chinese, they'll do that. So I just keep the word metron, M-E-T-R-O-N. It's Greek. It's the transliteration of the ancient Greek metron. And the way I translate it into English, I just spell it out, the proper measure. Now, what is this proper measure? If it's not an arithmetical mean, then what is it? Well, it exists, that's for sure, but it can't be come to through a mathematical analysis. So what is the power then that gives a vision of the proper measure? Well, for that, we're going to postpone that, but I'll just tell you what it is now. It's one of the 5 intellectual virtues, which is chapter 6, is all devoted to the intellectual virtues, or book 6. And one of those is called phronesis, P-H-R-O-N-E-S-I-S. It's pronounced phronesis. Some people say phronesis. It's probably phronesis in Greek. It means practical wisdom. Sometimes it's translated as prudence. You may see prudence in your book. It translates the Greek phronesis. It's that power. That's why that one makes possible all the moral virtues. So if a person lacks practical wisdom, then they can't find the proper measure. They go to excess or deficiency in their behavior or in their feelings. And they lose that metron. They lose that balance. If they lose the balance, then what happens is vice comes into the character. So the differentia, what makes a virtue and not just some other disposition, like irascibility or stinginess or any other vice, what makes it virtue is this disposition to choose the proper measure in our feelings and actions. Now, this proper measure is relative. It's not completely relative. If it were completely relative, then anyone could say, I'm acting with the proper measure. I'm cleansing the world of this race of people who are parasites on humanity. So we're going to commit a genocide, and this is my proper measure. So it can't be anything completely relative. Otherwise, all is permitted, right? Then you don't have morality anymore. But there is a proper measure, but it's relative. It's relative in three ways. It depends on the situation. If you just got paid and your waitress is being very nice and you can see she's working very hard, then you could be a little more generous because you just got paid. It's a good waitress. And so generosity comes naturally. So the situation, to a certain extent, determines the proper measure. The other thing that determines the proper measure is the person's character. Some people are generous by nature. And so even if they give a lot, and I'm just using generosity as an example, he talks about 12 different moral virtues. So it depends on the person. Some people, let's say, are generous by nature. So even when they give a lot, they feel like they haven't given enough. So that determines the proper measure is relative in that way also. And it's also relative to the particular proper measure you're talking about. If you're talking about generosity, since I use that as an example, then generosity by its very nature as a virtue is closer to extravagance than it is stinginess. It's closer to the excess than it is the deficiency. So Aristotle gives us a rule of thumb. Stay clear of the extreme that's more opposed to the mean or to the proper measure. In other words, there's always an extreme and there's a deficiency. Those are excesses. There's excess and deficiency. They're two extremes. Usually we think of the word extreme in terms of excess, but one could be extremely deficient too. So he says, so when it comes to, let's say, let's use a different example, courage instead of generosity. Courage by its very nature is closer to confidence than it is cowardice. So overly confident is a vice, and the deficiency would be cowardice. So there's always two vices connected to each virtue. Stay clear of the extreme that's more opposed to the mean. It's like a rule of thumb. So this has become one of the big headlines in the history of moral theory, at least in virtue ethics. Aristotle demarcates out 12 spheres of feelings or actions, like confidence, and they're poles, like confidence and fear. They're two poles. And in between, there's a continuum that moves somewhere in between extremely confident and extremely fearful. Because what is fear but the lack of confidence? What is confidence but controlling your fear? It doesn't mean you don't have fear. Ask anybody, who's been in battle or faced things in a courageous way. They'll be the first to tell you they felt fear, but they control it. So, or generosity, there could be extravagance where somebody just gives indiscriminately to the wrong people, the wrong times, and then there's stinginess. There's always excess and deficiency. So what he does, he demarcates out 12 spheres of feelings or actions, like confidence and fear is a feeling, right? Or the pleasures of touch and taste, which are the two most rudimentary senses. We have 5 senses. The two most basic, if you list the 5 senses in terms of their nearness to the material world, the one that comes closest to the material world is the sense of touch. The next one is taste, and then smell, then hearing, then sight. So he takes the two most rudimentary ones, touch and taste, and examines the pleasures that come with them. There's pleasures that come with all 5 senses. So that has touches, sex and sensuality. Taste is eating and drinking. So when it comes to eating, drinking, and sex, then there's self-indulgence, which would be the excess, and there would be, oh, let's see, what is the deficiency when it comes to that? Insensitivity. And then the proper measure is temperance, sophrosine in Greek. Or giving and taking, that's an action. So if one gives indiscriminately, that's called extravagance. If one takes, then one becomes stingy. The quality becomes stinginess. So extravagance and stingy are the two vices. So there's a vice of excess, a vice of deficiency, and then there's the proper measure. So it's not that hard idea. It's just very solid. And it's not mediocre to find the proper measure, because it's difficult to find the proper measure. If you think about your life, think about the mistakes you've made in life. Usually it has to do with going too much or not enough. You've missed the mark, the proper measure. So the whole idea is to find that proper measure in our feelings and actions, and then moral virtue accrues naturally in one's character. Okay? So that's the theory in general. Now, so we could go over some more of these. Let's just go over a few more, and then I want to talk about how this is all related to human nature. But get the big picture first. It's not that hard. He demarcates out 12 spheres of feelings or actions, like giving and taking. We'll go over some more. We went over our like confidence and fear. There's giving and taking on a grand scale. We'll talk. So these are the spheres. Then each sphere has an excess or deficiency. So if you act habitually with the excess, then that vice of excess will come into your character. If you act with a deficiency with regard to whatever sphere you're talking about, they're not really spheres. I keep drawing a circle because my mind works spatially like that. They're like bubbles. When I teach this in face-to-face, I usually draw circles on the board. And they're realms, but they don't exist in the physical world. They're just ways of depicting that. And each one has an excess or deficiency. And in between, there's this continuum. When he talks about the mean, he uses examples from art and from athletes as metaphors, because he wants to say there is a proper measure, and it's not arrived at arithmetically. And it's arrived at by means of this power of this intellectual virtue, not a moral virtue, phronesis, and we'll talk about that. And it's there that he sheds very valuable light on how do we find the mean. So I'm deliberately postponing that. Or not the mean, the proper measure, the metron. But he uses examples from like, if you're like an athlete who's just beginning to train, they don't need so much food. So the proper measure is less. They don't have to eat so much, to get in shape. But people who are at that tip-top shape, I'm sure people in the Olympics who are doing like running and anything that involves extreme exertion, and they're in tip-top shape, their bodies are like furnaces. They just eat, and they burn it up. So the proper measure changes depending on what kind of shape the person is in. The other example he gives is of the relativity of the mean is from art. And this one speaks to me a little bit better. If you look at a piece of art, and it doesn't matter what kind, it could be music or poetry or sculpture, whatever, dance, there's something about it that's perfect. If the artist would have worked too much, a little bit more, it would have been overly done. If they hadn't worked it as much as they did, it would be not enough. You get this sense that it's just right. There's nothing left to be desired. It's perfect. So that sense, that helped me to understand what he meant by the mean. If you think about it, many of the great things that have been said and done and go down into history, they're not because they're so magnificent. It's because they were the exact right thing to say in this particular moment. So it's a matter of according with the times and doing what it's called for. So it's all about doing the right thing, but how to find the right thing. For Aristotle, the right thing to do is find the proper measure. If a situation is too much, then try to bring it down. If it's too far down, then you have to bring it up. We have to find that balance. And it's not easy. And the reason it's not easy is the same reason why moral virtue is rare. If it were easy, then everybody would be virtuous. So it's difficult. But those people who become virtuous, in the true sense of virtue, the word virtue, actually, I usually stay away from it because it has with it all kinds of connotations that come, especially from Christianity, from 2,500 years of Christianity. And it, I'm not against Christianity. I'm just saying, if you want to get back to the Greek sense of virtue, then it might be prudent not to use the word virtue. Just use the word arete, excellence of character. But I use the word moral virtue. You just have to watch when you say words that connotations don't cling to those words taken from some alien source. Because we're trying to get back to the Greeks here. So in order to get back to the Greeks, we have to get back before Christianity. So we have to get back before the word virtue meant being selfless and things like that. In fact, one of the moral virtues for Aristotle is pride, feeling good about some work that's well done. And that's one of the 7 deadly sins in Christianity. So, these virtues, by the way, that Aristotle is talking about have come to be called the natural virtues by theologians. And then there are the supernatural virtues like faith, hope, and charity, which are Christian virtues. There's nothing like faith, hope, and charity. There's hope, but not hope for an afterlife, like in Christianity. And charity, that's a Christian virtue too. There's generosity, which is close to charity, but that's a different thing. So what I try to do is, if I'm studying Greek philosophy, I try to get back to the Greeks. If I'm doing Christian philosophy, then I try to get into the Christians. Well, I don't think I need to go through all 12 different spheres of feelings or actions and the extremes and the moral virtue. He does that for you in the text. I'll just point out a few others to you to make sure that you get the picture. So we talked about courage, temperance, generosity. There's one called magnificence. I like this one because it puts a certain moral obligation onto rich people. And I think rich people need to spread the wealth around a little bit more. Everybody, half the population on the earth are starving to death. There's something wrong with that system, right? So I agree with the Pope, that the wealth needs to be distributed. But people have all kinds of feelings, strong feelings about this. But in Aristotle, if you're rich, then you're obliged to spend that wealth, keep it circulating, and spend it suitably for the common good. You remember Aristotle in his political theory is a Republican political theorist, Republican with a little r. It's important, especially nowadays, to make this distinction. Republican political theory, like Aristotle, Plato, the whole history of Republican political theory, I use little r for that. And then there's the Republican Party, which changes depending on what kind of people take over the party. Nowadays, a certain group of people have taken over the Republican Party. So there's a big difference between the Republican Party with a capital R and then lowercase r. I just use lowercase and just to make the distinction. So since Aristotle is a true Republican, he believes that the wealthy should circulate the wealth. If you hoard the wealth in one place, then you make poverty somewhere else. It's very simple. There's a commonwealth. There's only so much wealth in the commonwealth. If the wealth is concentrated in one particular area because of sectarian interest, then there's poverty somewhere else. It doesn't trickle down or overflow or anything like that. These are just theories. In reality, when the wealth is concentrated in one place, it makes poverty somewhere else. So Aristotle knows that full well. And you don't have to be a macroeconomist to know that. It's just basic common sense. So he believes that if you're rich, then you need to, he calls it suitable expenditure on a grand scale for the common good. Like commissioning an artist to make a fountain, for example. That's why there's so many fountains in Italy. Italy was the center of the Italian Renaissance, of the Renaissance. And there was people like Lorenzo the Magnificent. His nickname became the Magnificent. He was one of the Medici, son of the Medicis, and they were rich bankers or merchants, I forget which. But they were not Republicans, but at the same time, they took over the government in Florence. And his nickname became Lorenzo the Magnificent because that book, the Nicomachean Ethics that we're studying, was an important book during the Renaissance. In fact, in that famous painting by Raphael, if you look closely to Aristotle, who's carrying that famous painting called the School of Athens. At the center is Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle's carrying the Nicomachean Ethics because that book was so important during the Renaissance. Well, people knew about that. So they called Lorenzo the Magnificent because they thought since he was spending so much money on the common good, he would have Michelangelo paint the Sistine ceiling, create the David, make all these fountains all over Rome and all over Florence. His nickname became the Magnificent. So there's a virtue that Aristotle talks about called magnificence, where, like I said, suitable expenditure on a grand scale for the common good. You don't see much of that going on now. Oh, there's one called friendliness, has to do with anger. So the extreme would be irascibility. The deficiency would be apathy. Pathos means feeling. So apathy means without feeling. So apathy is a vice, and irascibility, being angry all the time about something, is the other vice of excess. And so gentleness or kindness becomes the proper measure. Oh, there's truthfulness is another virtue. He's not talking about truth in the sense of finding truth, and he's talking about speaking about yourself. Speak truthfully about yourself. So there are people who boast all the time, and that's called vanity. And then there are people who are putting themselves down all the time. So that would be the vice of deficiency. And so truthfulness is the virtue of having to do with the proper measure in one's own self-regard. There's proper ambition. Some people are overly ambitious. Some people lack ambition. So there's the excess, deficiency, proper ambition is the virtue. Pride has to do with if you go overboard in thinking you're higher and greater than you truly are, that's called vanity. But so pride has to do with feeling good about a job well done. And there's nothing wrong with that for Aristotle. I mean, there's no reason to deprive yourself of feeling proud of something that's praiseworthy, okay? But it can't go to excess, and then it turns into vanity. Oh, there's kindness, we talked about that. Friendliness is another one. There's some people who are overly friendly. By the way, when he lays this out, and this is how he does it in the book, he lays it out in outline form first in book 2. And then he starts in detail. He goes into depth. And I read this a few times. I've taught it for years, but I remember my original readings. I went very slowly, and I enjoyed his detailed discussion of all the moral virtues. Actually, hardly anyone does this, and if you're honest, but someone could actually take this stuff seriously and use it to help give shape to their character, which would be a good thing. You know, I may have done it to a certain extent, but some people, I can imagine somebody actually doing this, you know, and taking it seriously, but and not just, you know, trying to get a good grade on a test. But so that's his moral theory in a nutshell. Um, oh, there's one I feel that's interesting and fascinating to me. It's called wittiness. When it comes to pleasantness in conversation, if you have a deficiency of that, then you become a boring person. Boorishness is the quality. And then if you go to excess, that's called buffoonery. I know that word buffo in Italian means clown. So buffoonery means you're trying too hard to be funny, and you yourself become ludicrous. People are laughing at you instead of, you know, with you. Um, but the proper measure is wittiness. And in his detailed discussion of all these moral virtues and the vices and the realms that demarcate each one, he goes into depth in these. And so you know, you learn about wittiness and you learn about all these moral virtues as you read about them. It has to do with the nimbleness of the character. Wit, ready wit, he calls it. Because what you do is you take something that's just happening and turn it just a little bit. It's a kind of a nimbleness of the mind, he calls it, like an acrobatic mind. And you turn it just a little bit and artfully shape it, and then it becomes comical. And it becomes, you become wit. It's called wit. It's witty. You're a witty person. And wittiness is one of the moral virtues. So that's, now how is all this related to human nature? Well, he doesn't thematize that question in that way. But if you put all the pieces together, it begins to make sense. The person who's developed these moral virtues, and it's not a matter, it's not black and white. It's not like you either have it or you don't, but it's a matter of degree, these moral virtues. They're like, they're excellences of character, like sparkles in somebody's character. They epitomize the human. So the more we advance toward moral virtues and cultivate these excellences in our character, the more human you become. That's the way I see it. And you're moving, as you move towards cultivating these moral excellences, these excellences of character, there's a happiness, there's a feeling of well-being that accompanies that. Okay? It may not be pleasure in the direct sense, like physical pleasure. Like if you're landing on Normandy Beach, you know, and you act courageously, I'm sure you're not feeling pleasure. It's not like eating, you know, an Epicurean delight. You know, it's harrowing. I mean, it's horrible. But at the same time, Aristotle thinks there's this deep sense of well-being in doing the right thing. And the right thing is always the proper measure. In case of Normandy Beach, the proper measure was, you know, to eliminate the enemy. I mean, you're in battle. So the situation demands extraordinary measures. So Aristotle's not a complete relativist when it comes to that position in morality has come to be called relativism or situational ethics, where you do whatever the situation tells you to do. He's not that much of a relativist, but he does say it's a mean relative to us. So there's a particular relativity to the mean, to the proper measure, but it's not arbitrary. Just like there's a proper amount of food for an athlete to eat, or the proper measure in working a work of art, there's a proper measure in our feelings and actions. So that's my best on his moral theory. I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of very difficult things in philosophy. In fact, in Aristotle's metaphysics, you know, you rack your brains. Even people who specialize in Aristotle, who know Greek and know the history of philosophy, and then they rack their brains on trying to understand what Aristotle's saying in his metaphysics, for example. But this is not rocket science. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. But at the same time, it's valuable and it's pretty hard to shake. I mean, I haven't. The only way you could sort of criticize this moral theory is, um, I don't want to get into the critique of Aristotle, but um, one could say, well, the proper measure is mediocre, or that it just leads to mediocrity. But that's not what he's saying. That's called a straw man. Only when you distort Aristotle's position and then attack that distorted position, then you can. But it's not beyond. Nothing is beyond critique. You know, one could. But let's not worry about that now. Let's just try to understand that, and then we'll go from there. All right. All right. I'll make one little shorter lecture on book 6, the intellectual virtues. That's very important too. All right.